Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to cover the end-to-end workflow when you're building applications which have front end and back end, right? So in previous videos, I've already covered how to implement web applications protected with IBM Cloud App ID, how to implement back-end applications using different technologies protected using IBM App ID. Now in this video, I actually want to bring everything together and show you how a front-end application can work with a web application can work with a back-end application which exposes APIs. Now, as a quick reminder, AppID is a service on IBM Cloud that allows you to easily connect your applications with identity providers, add authentication, authorization, access control for your users in your applications, right, and do this seamlessly and very easily. Now, if you recall previous videos, right, we had this picture used quite frequently. So essentially, this picture kind of outlines the end-to-end workflow when application first obtains tokens from authorization server, and users need to authenticate in order to get those tokens. And then application can make a request to protected resources to some kind of a backend API, right, and the technology used in this workflow. Now, so far I've talked separately about the application getting tokens from authorization server and user authentication workflow, right? We've talked about this part separately. I've talked about this part separately, where you're making a request to protected backend, right? Protected resources with those tokens using bearer token workflow and how JWT validation works, right? But today I actually want to summarize everything and show an end-to-end workflow, essentially a workflow that will have both web application doing authentication and obtaining tokens, and then that application will be making requests to protected resources. Now, speaking of workflows, I will not focus on those charts too much, right, because you've seen them on previous videos, but essentially when you have a web application, in most cases it will be using authorization code workflow, right, and that's the workflow where user is redirected to authorization server for authentication and then redirected back to your application, and application can now retrieve tokens and store those tokens in the application server, right? And then user is considered authenticated. Now, this is the authorization code workflow. The bearer token workflow is when application is using those tokens in order to make requests to some kind of a protected resource or resource server, right? That's the workflow that we've also covered in previous videos. And the end-to-end workflow looks something like that, right? So first of all, user opens the application in browser. User needs to log in. User will be redirected for authentication and possibly authorization. I can encapsulate all of that in this single segment on the diagram, right? Eventually, application will retrieve tokens, access token and AD tokens, and those tokens will be stored in the application. And at some point, the application would need to make a request to a protected resource. So it might be triggered by user doing some action in browser. It might be triggered by something that's going on in the application itself, right? But at some point, application would need to make a request to that protected resource. Now, in order to do that, application will be able to use the token it obtained previously, right, in order to get access. So for the sake of this demo, I've built a very simple banking kind of setup, right? So I have a web application that will serve as a front end, and I have a backend application that will serve as a backend. You will see that the backend application essentially exposes a simple API, banking API version 2 customer balance with a hard-coded value, right, just for the sake of simplicity of this demo, right? And the web application will use that API in order to obtain user's balance, okay? And it will display the user name, which is coming from ID token, and user's balance, which will be coming from a protected resource. Now, again, to summarize, this is the end-to-end workflow we're building. Now, let's start to take a look at the code. Now, I got two applications here, right, in my Visual Studio Code. I'll share the source code for both applications, obviously, right? Let's start with the top window. This is the banking API application, right? So it is very simple. If you followed my previous video, you know exactly what's going on in here. And I will be using Node.js in order to show this end-to-end demo, but you can be using any language that you want. Okay, essentially, it's a simple application using Passport, initializing Passport with API strategy. Since this is an API application, it exposes an API, right? And you can see that the whole application is protected. So I'm saying that app.use, that's Express application, right, uses Passport strategy with API strategy. Okay, so the whole application is protected. Now, I've defined a simple API for that application, as you've seen in the slides, banking API v2/customer/balance, and essentially it just returns a hard-coded value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, now if I start my application, npm start, right, you can see that it's running on port 3001, right? So if I try to open, I'm immediately getting unauthorized. And that's actually expected, right? So let's just copy the full URL, right, to show you that we're still getting the same response, right? We're getting unauthorized, right? This is expected because my application is protected by App ID, and in order to access this API, a valid access token is required. So let's try to invoke this API using a valid access token. Let me open Postman. Okay, I'll paste my the URL here. I'll click send. Okay, and you can see that I'm getting 401, right? And the response is unauthorized, as expected. So in order to access this API, I need an access token. So I'm going to copy the access token I obtained previously. Okay, this is a valid access token I got previously for this AppID instance. And I will add a header called authorization, right? And the value is bearer. Oops, need to copy the token value. Sorry about that. Copy and bearer and the value of the token. Okay, so this is exactly how bearer token works, right? So now when I send request, I will actually see the balance, right? Because this is a valid access token. It grants me access. If I disable this header, I'm getting unauthorized again. If I enable it, it just works, okay? So you can see that the backend is protected. There is absolutely nothing new here, right? This is something that we've seen previously. Now let's take a look at the web part of the application, right? So the backend continues to run in the background. Okay, so again, the web application is instrumented with AppID SDK, similarly to the way I've explained before. Okay, but the web application exposes a new API called /API/user. Okay, now, this API does one thing, right? First of all, it retrieves access token, right, from a previously authenticated user. So essentially, this API is protected, and it can only be accessed once user is authenticated. So you can actually see it here. This is where the endpoint is protected. So I'm saying whenever a request is made to the /API, right, if I have request on the user proceed to next, right? So basically the next middleware will be called, request will hit this code. Otherwise, just return 401 unauthorized. So basically, everything under /API can only be accessed for authenticated users. Now, my /API/user is assuming that user is authenticated because otherwise this condition would fail. Okay, and it's retrieving access token from request session. Okay, we have this web app strategy dot authentication context object stored inside of the request session, and it contains access token payload, ID token, and ID token payload decoded. So the value that I need is access token. That's exactly what I'm retrieving. And then I'm sending a request to the API server, right? So localhost 3001/banking/API v2 customer balance. That's exactly the endpoint that we feed before, right? The headers are authorization, bearer, and the value of access token. Okay, and you can see here that whenever I receive a response, right? I'm checking whether response, well, the status code is not for a 1, right? Basically, I didn't get for a 1 back. There is no error. Otherwise, I will just print an error message. But if everything is true, the balance will be backend response body dot balance, okay? And then I'm going to return user. User's name will be taken from request username. That's copied from ID token. And the balance is the balance that I've retrieved from the backend response. So this is the object object I expect to receive on my front-end application. Okay, so let's start this application. It runs on a different port, on port 3000, and see how it works. Okay, so I'm going to open the application. Okay, I'm actually going to open my debug tools, right, just so you can see all the requests that will be going on here. Okay, so welcome to Acme Banking. That's my application. Okay, I click login. Okay, and right here you can see that first of all I need to log in. It doesn't really matter which identity provider you use. I'll use Facebook because that's easiest, right? And now I'm back into the application, right? And you can see that it's displaying hello Anton Alexander, that's my name, and your balance that's the number returned from the protected backend. So you can see that this request to /API/user endpoint was made, right? And the response was as expected, user my name, and the balance retrieved from the backend. Okay, so this is in a nutshell end-to-end workflow. Okay, first of all, a user has authenticated. Once user has authenticated, application obtained access token and ID token on behalf of the user, okay, representing the user authorization and authentication. And then whenever I call the slash, right, whatever I call this one, /API/user API on my web application, right? Inside of that web application, I made a request to API application with the access token that was retrieved previously, right? So the API server actually got that token, validated that token successfully, and returned me my balance. So I'm taking this balance, adding that to the response object, and returning everything all the way back to the browser. Right. So this is more or less end-to-end workflow. I used Node.js in order to show how it works. It doesn't really matter which language you use. The workflow is exactly the same. Your front-end, web application, mobile application, backend application can use same language, different languages. It doesn't really matter. It's exactly the same protocol always and everywhere. And that's the beauty of using the standard protocols. Okay, so thanks everyone, and till next time.